In a snowbound headquarters deep in East Prussia, on a cold night in January of 1942, Adolf Hitler leaned back at his dinner table and told the men around him something he genuinely believed. America, he said, was finished before it started. A broken country, racially mixed beyond saving, soft, divided, incapable of the kind of sacrifice real war demanded. He was one of the most powerful men on earth at that moment. And he could not have been more wrong. Halfway around the world, in a small office near a half-built shipyard in Richmond, California, a 57-year-old man who had never constructed a single ship in his life was staring at a sketch on a piece of notepaper. His name was Henry Kaiser. He had spent his career building dams and highways. Ships were a different animal entirely, and every expert in the industry would have told him so. The professionals said a cargo ship took 8 months to build, minimum. Kaiser looked at his sketch and told his foreman they were going to do it in 4 days. That sentence sounds impossible. It very nearly was. But understanding how Henry Kaiser proved an entire industry wrong is also the story of how the United States proved Adolf Hitler catastrophically, fatally wrong. Here is where this story really begins, and it begins with arrogance. In the years before Pearl Harbor, German military intelligence had been quietly compiling assessments of the United States. Industrial output, military readiness, national character. The conclusions landed on Hitler's desk again and again, and they all said the same thing. America was a nation of shopkeepers and car salesmen, not soldiers. As late as 1939, the entire United States Army ranked smaller than the Army of Portugal. Factories across the country were busy stamping out automobiles and home appliances, not tanks or warplanes. After a decade of relative peace and a brutal economic depression, the American public had no appetite left for war. When President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress in May of 1940 and announced that American factories would soon be producing 50,000 aircraft per year, German high command did not see a warning. They saw a punchline. The United States had built fewer than 3,000 military aircraft total in 1939. The idea that production could explode by a factor of nearly 20 within a few short years struck German planners as something between wishful thinking and outright fantasy. Hermann Göring agreed completely. As the architect of the Luftwaffe, the most feared air force on the continent, Göring understood precisely what it took to produce a modern combat aircraft. Specialized alloys, years of refined engineering, a skilled workforce built up over a generation. America, in his estimation, had none of it. The notion that you could simply convert a car factory into a bomber factory seemed almost insulting to the craft he had spent his life perfecting. There was also history backing up this confidence. German generals remembered the First World War, when American troops arrived late, fought relatively briefly, and suffered comparatively light losses next to the bloodletting endured by the European powers. To men who had survived years in the trenches, the American soldiers of 1918 looked inexperienced, untested, soft. Albert Speer, who would go on to become Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later recalled sitting through dinner after dinner where Hitler repeated his theory of America almost like scripture. The Americans had barely sacrificed blood in the last war, Hitler insisted. Their fighting spirit was weak. And in his view, there was no such thing as a unified American people at all, just a scattered collection of immigrants from dozens of nations and backgrounds with no common identity to rally around. This was not a passing comment. It was the foundation of his entire worldview. Hitler's ideology held that a nation's strength came from racial purity and ethnic unity. Germany, in his mind, possessed a pure bloodline that translated directly into battlefield dominance. America, a country built by immigration, with a deeply diverse population, could never produce that same kind of unified strength. It was, in his thinking, mathematically destined to fail. But there was a fatal blind spot buried inside every one of these assumptions. German analysts were judging America's potential by America's peacetime habits. They saw factories making refrigerators and assumed those factories were incapable of making rifles. They saw a population that had not mobilized and concluded that population could not mobilize. They saw diversity and mistook it for division. Every single one of those assumptions was about to be demolished. The transformation actually began before America had even formally entered the war. In the summer of 1940, with France collapsed, and Britain standing alone against the German war machine, Roosevelt issued a challenge to American industry that historians would later call nothing short of a miracle. Car factories would stop making cars. Appliance makers would stop making toasters and refrigerators. Every machine tool in the country would be repurposed for one single goal. The scale of this shift is almost impossible to overstate. In 1941, American factories produced over 3 million automobiles for civilian use. Over the following 4 years combined, the entire American auto industry built fewer than 150 new civilian cars. The whole industry simply stopped making cars and started making war machines instead. Chrysler began manufacturing aircraft fuselages. General Motors started producing airplane engines, artillery, trucks, and tanks. Packard, a luxury car maker, began building the engines that powered British fighter planes. Companies that had never built anything more dangerous than a kitchen mixer were suddenly mass-producing live ammunition. How did this conversion happen so fast? The answer lies in something the German planners completely failed to account for. Decades earlier, American manufacturers had perfected a system of standardized, interchangeable parts. A component built in a factory in Ohio could be shipped to a different factory in Michigan and bolt directly onto a machine assembled in California, with no custom fitting required. That manufacturing philosophy, developed for cars and appliances, was about to be unleashed on the machinery of war. Skeptics insisted it could never work for something as complicated as an aircraft. You cannot simply stamp out a bomber the way you stamp out a sedan, they argued. A single heavy bomber contained over 1 million individual parts. An automobile of that era had roughly 15,000. The tolerances on aircraft components were measured in fractions of an inch. That could mean the difference between flight and disaster. Henry Kaiser had heard arguments like this before, and he had ignored every one of them. In December of 1940, Kaiser secured a contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British war effort. He had no shipyard, no trained shipbuilders, no history in maritime construction whatsoever. What he had instead was something far more valuable. A completely different way of thinking about the problem. Kaiser did not approach shipbuilding as a craft passed down through generations of skilled tradesmen. He approached it as an engineering puzzle that could be broken apart, optimized, and rebuilt from scratch. Traditional shipbuilders trained their riveters for years before trusting them with serious work. Kaiser did not have years. He had weeks. So he redesigned the entire process. Instead of building a single ship from the ground up on one slipway, the way it had been done for centuries, Kaiser built individual sections in separate fabrication stations scattered across his yard, then assembled the finished pieces like enormous puzzle blocks. He replaced traditional riveting with welding wherever possible, a technique that was faster and required far less specialized training. He recruited workers from every corner of the country and built entire communities around his shipyards, complete with housing, childcare centers, and medical clinics to keep his workforce healthy and on the job. The speed of this transformation defied everything the old guard believed was possible. Farmers from Oklahoma who had lost their land in the Dust Bowl. Factory workers laid off during the Depression. Women who had never held a job outside their own kitchen. African American workers seeking opportunities the segregated South had denied them for generations. All of them streamed into Kaiser's training programs, and within roughly 10 days, an ordinary person with no industrial background could become a competent welder. Within 30 days, they were a productive member of a shipbuilding crew. At its peak, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard employed more than 90,000 workers. Nearly a third of them were women, performing welding and riveting work that had been considered exclusively male territory just a few years earlier. These women became the visual symbol of the entire American home front effort, immortalized in government posters and newsreels as the backbone of wartime production. Traditional shipbuilders watched all of this unfold and could barely believe what they were seeing. Everything Kaiser was doing violated the established rules of the craft. Ships were supposed to be riveted by hand, not welded in pieces. Construction was supposed to happen slowly, methodically, by workers with years of apprenticeship behind them. Kaiser's methods broke every one of those rules. And his methods worked better than anyone could have predicted. In 1941, the average cargo ship took 230 days to construct. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had cut that down to 45 days. Then 30. Then 20. In November of 1942, workers at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard laid the keel for a Liberty ship named the Robert E. Perry and launched the completed, fully operational vessel just 4 days and 15 hours later. That ship was finished faster than a German U-boat needed to cross the Atlantic Ocean. This single fact would soon become a strategic catastrophe for Germany's entire naval war plan. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of Germany's submarine fleet, had built his entire strategy around one simple piece of arithmetic. If his U-boats could sink Allied cargo ships faster than American shipyards could replace them, Britain would eventually be starved into surrender. For the first half of 1942, that strategy looked terrifyingly effective. German submarines prowled the American East Coast in what their crews nicknamed the Second Happy Time, sinking ship after ship within plain sight of American beaches. Oil tankers burned off the coast of Florida. Cargo vessels went down close enough to shore that families in New Jersey could watch the flames from their windows. American cities along the coast had not even implemented basic nighttime blackout procedures, leaving silhouetted ships perfectly lit against the glow of shoreline lights for prowling U-boat captains to pick off. With ease, one German commander, Reinhard Hardagen, sank 8 ships on a single patrol and returned home a national hero. Other captains rushed to follow his example. Across the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American waters alone. Oil that should have powered Allied tanks burned uselessly on the ocean floor. Food meant for British civilians rotted at the bottom of the Atlantic. Donitz believed, with good reason at the time, that he was winning. But while German torpedoes were finding their targets, American shipyards were quietly winning a different kind of war entirely. In 1942, American shipbuilders launched roughly 8 million tons of new cargo shipping. In 1943, that number jumped to 19 million tons. By the autumn of 1943, new ship construction had finally overtaken submarine losses for the first time in the conflict. Every single ship the U-boats managed to sink was being replaced by 2 more. Rolling out of American shipyards. Donitz watched his own numbers with growing dread. His submarines were sinking ships at a pace that would have crippled Britain during the previous World War. But this was not the previous World War. This was an opponent whose industrial capacity had simply become incomprehensible by the old rules of naval warfare. Donitz calculated that he needed to sink roughly 700,000 tons of Allied shipping every single month just to strangle Britain's supply lines. He came agonizingly close in 1942. But by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching over 1 million tons of new shipping in a single month. The target Donitz needed to hit kept sliding further out of reach, month after month after month. The Americans were also learning fast. The disastrous early months along the East Coast had exposed glaring weaknesses in anti-submarine defenses. Cargo ships began sailing in tightly escorted convoys. Aircraft patrols expanded across the shipping lanes. New radar and sonar technology gave Allied escorts capabilities German captains had never faced before. By May of 1943, Donitz was forced to pull his submarines out of the North Atlantic entirely. In that single brutal month, Germany lost 43 U-boats. The losses had become unsustainable compared to what the submarines were actually managing to sink. The Battle of the Atlantic, the campaign Germany absolutely needed to win in order to strangle Britain into submission, was over. And Germany had lost it. The submarine crews who survived that catastrophic month limped back into occupied France in a state of genuine shock. They had sailed out believing they were winning a war. They returned understanding they had lost one. What happened on the Atlantic Ocean was about to be repeated in the skies above Europe, on an even more staggering scale. Just outside Detroit, Ford Motor Company had constructed a facility called Willow Run, designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn. The building covered roughly 3.5 million square feet under a single roof, making it the largest factory of any kind anywhere on the planet at the time. Its single purpose was to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a massive 4-engine heavy bomber, vastly more complex than anything Ford's engineers had ever attempted to build. The technical challenges were staggering. A single B-24 contained over 1 million individual parts and more than 300,000 rivets across 550 different sizes. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied how the original manufacturer was building these aircraft and found the methods almost shockingly primitive. Bombers were being assembled outdoors, largely by hand, using techniques barely changed in decades. Sorensen proposed something that struck many in the industry as borderline insane. Build bombers on a moving assembly line, the exact same way Ford built cars. Industry leaders openly scoffed. The president of a rival aircraft company famously compared the idea to expecting a blacksmith to assemble a fine watch overnight. Their skepticism was not unreasonable. A car with minor manufacturing flaws can still drive perfectly fine down the highway. An aircraft with minor flaws can fall out of the sky. The tolerances required were measured in thousandths of an inch. The materials were specialized alloys that behaved nothing like ordinary automotive steel. Every hydraulic, electrical, and pneumatic system inside the aircraft had to function flawlessly at 25,000 feet in brutal sub-zero temperatures. Ford struggled badly at first. Design changes from combat feedback kept forcing the company to retool the entire assembly line. The press began mocking the facility, twisting its name into a joke about whether it would ever actually run. A young senator, named Harry Truman, launched an investigation into the repeated delays and publicly questioned whether Ford could deliver on its enormous promises at all. Ford's response to all of this criticism was simply to keep working. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting rough combat modification sketches into precise, usable manufacturing blueprints, churning out roughly 5 miles of new technical drawings every single day. When design changes made yesterday's drawings useless, the engineers simply started over without complaint. Ford also rebuilt the entire supply chain from scratch. Rather than manufacturing every component inside Willow Run itself, the company built a vast network of subcontractors across the country. Engines arrived from a Buick plant in Flint. Propellers came from a specialized manufacturer in Connecticut. Landing gear arrived from a tire company in Ohio. Coordinating a supply chain of that complexity would have overwhelmed almost any organization on Earth that had not spent decades mastering large-scale logistics. By 1944, every one of those early struggles had been solved. Willow Run was producing one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. At the absolute peak of production in April of 1944, the plant turned out 453 finished bombers in a single month. Over a single 72-hour stretch that same month, 100 fully completed bombers rolled off the line and flew away from the facility. The plant ran 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week, using the remaining hours each day purely for maintenance and retooling. And even with that relentless output, the workforce needed to run the line actually shrank from 42,000 workers down to 17,000 as the process became more efficient. The same number of bombers, produced by a fraction of the original workforce. Eventually, the United States military had to ask Ford to slow production down. There was simply nowhere left to park all the finished aircraft. Training bases across the country had overflowing storage yards packed with B-24s waiting for crews to fly them. This staggering output was not an isolated achievement. It was the new normal across American industry. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 96,000 military aircraft. That single year of production exceeded Japan's entire aircraft output for the whole war combined. Across the full span of the conflict, American factories built nearly 300,000 military aircraft, representing roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced anywhere on Earth. Lined up wingtip to wingtip, those 300,000 aircraft would stretch for more than 30,000 miles, enough to circle the entire planet at the equator. Behind every one of those aircraft, every ship, every tank rolling off American assembly lines, stood a supply chain stretching back across the entire continent. Aluminum shipped from South American mines. Rubber from plantations in Liberia and Brazil after Japanese conquests cut off traditional Asian supplies. Cotton from southern farms turned into uniforms. Food from the agricultural heartland feeding millions of workers and soldiers alike. Women who had spent their entire lives inside their own homes learned to operate industrial machinery their mothers had never even seen. African American families migrated north by the hundreds of thousands to fill factory jobs that had been closed to them for generations. Entire cities reshaped themselves almost overnight to house workers pouring in from farms and small towns across the country. This was the country Adolf Hitler had dismissed as decayed and divided beyond saving in a dinner conversation back in January of 1942. A nation he believed had no unifying identity, no capacity for sacrifice, no real fighting spirit at all. He was judging an entire civilization by its quietest moments.